Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Donovid Sekulits. I'm the Latinx Outreach and Library Service Coordinator. Tonight, I've been looking forward tonight for a few months, and I'm excited to see it happen. So tonight we have John Paul Brammer, local OKEQ. He is a writer and artist from Lawton, Oklahoma. He is currently based in Brooklyn. He started his advice column, Hola Papi, in 2017, and thousands of letters later, there's now a memoir of the same name published by Simon & Schuster's flagship imprint and available where books are sold. So I will let JP introduce him, tell him more about himself.
Hi, everyone. My mic on? Oh, it is. Okay. I thought I was going to have to project. When I was in Catholic school, I used to have to do the readings, and the priest was always like, that young man, he reads to the back row, so it would be fine. But I'm glad that we have this. Hello, it is so wonderful to be here. This is my very first in-person event with this book, and I am just so honored. I had a virtual book tour, which was really humiliating. It was just like welcome to Los Angeles. It's like, I'm in my living room, but thank you. It's like, not exactly the glamorous experience that I was hoping for, but we do what we can, where we can get it. And I'm just so happy to be in Oklahoma for this first event because yes, I am an Okie, I am from here. And just to have all of you in this room sharing this moment with me is so incredible. It means a lot to me. When my book came out, most of my events were actually scheduled for the coastal cities. And I talked with my publisher, I was like, you know where I'm from, right? Like we should have maybe one book event in Oklahoma. And they're like, yeah, we'll get to it. And that's just sort of the general sentiment I think that way too many people have about our home state, which is that, queer people don't exist here, that we don't have too much going on, but I happen to know that's not the case. And I'm just so happy to see everyone in this room here today. And I can't wait to read some of my book and have this conversation today. Thank you so much, by the way, for making this happen. Really incredible. When I got the invitation, I just jumped on it because I was like, yes, I want to go back to Oklahoma immediately, sight unseen. Because, again, I used to work at a bookstore in Oklahoma City, and I think that above all else, was the most foundational experience of my literary career because I kind of got to know, okay, this is how books work. It was mostly selling copies of Pioneer Woman. I got so used to answering the phone for her events that I started answering the phone as Pioneer Woman. I was like, yes, hello, Reed Drummond. It was horrible, actually. She's a very sweet lady. She's not here today, but... in any case, yes, I am from Lawton, Oklahoma, Cache, Oklahoma, Comanche County. A very, very small town. We were the only Mexicans around. We were some of the only people around. Most of our neighbors were cows. One interesting thing that has happened in our neck of the woods is that a wealthy family has moved into the land next to us and now has bison as pets. And so now people stop their cars in front of our house to take pictures of them. Because as you know, the wildlife refuge is one of the few places where you can actually get up close and personal with a bison. Now you can do it in the Brammers next door backyard. You see Sandy Brammer, tell her I said hold on. But writing this book and centering it on a rural queer experience was very important to me. I kind of wanted to show the world that there is a little bit more going on around here than we often get credit for. And one chapter that I think illustrates that really well was the chapter in which I start working at a tortilla factory in a desperate attempt to learn how to speak Spanish and make Mexican food because my abuelos didn't teach me. My abuela was a very cranky, very direct, very iconic lady from Chihuahua, Mexico, who ended up living in Texas, couldn't speak any English, dropped out of elementary school to do manual labor. My abuelo was the first in his entire family to go to college, and he was very much estranged from his family for that. And so when they had my mom, and they brought her over to Oklahoma from Texas, they sort of made the decision, okay, we're not going to teach her Spanish because we know how much trouble this language was for us. And you're in Oklahoma, I mean, who are you going to speak Spanish to? The cows? Not really. So I didn't grow up with a whole lot of Spanish. I was around when my abuelos spoke to each other, but I really didn't get a whole lot of it. So when I started growing up and I realized that my entire white family was alienated from us, and I didn't really know why, and people in school were just starting to treat me a little differently, and I didn't know why, and I was learning the history of our culture and our heritage, and I thought, I don't have any of this stuff, actually. I was raised by my abuelos, who are essentially from an entirely different planet from me. Even though they were the ones who raised me, they spoke a different language, they had a different accent, they looked very different. My abuelos were very dark-skinned, and they were obviously treated very differently from the way I was, or the way my sister was. And all this stuff had the effect of really confusing me, and I think when you're an adolescent, you kind of look in the waters for the first time, and you see your reflection, and you think, who am I? What am I? What am I supposed to do? Very queer sentiment happening there as well. And so I thought, oh my God, I have got to learn Spanish, I have got to toughen up, I have got to be a cholo, I have got to figure out how to be a Mexican. And this really pissed my abuela off when I told her that I was gonna go make tortillas down the road. Because you see, my abuela had put all this work into making me white. And so when I told her that, no, actually I wanna learn our culture, I wanna learn Spanish, I wanna learn our customs, she was just like, mijo, that's not a good idea. I don't know why you're doing that. Blah, 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 blah. Because these were things that caused problems for her in her life. And so we did not see eye to eye on that. So the excerpt that I'm going to read from my book, and one thing you need to know about my book if you haven't read it is that it is sort of mimicking the format of my advice column, Hola Papi. So each chapter has a sort of prompt at the beginning that asks a question, and I sort of answer it with a life story. And so if you hear me say the word panicked, it's because the letter writer in this case is Panicked Hispanic, and I'm just like answering him. And this is towards the end where I've been working with my coworkers for a long time. I'm starting to look into going to college, which was another big difference between me and the people I was working with, because the people I worked with, it turns out, had very little in common with me aside from being Mexican by heritage. A lot of them were undocumented, a lot of them had kids they were trying to support, and it sort of taught me that you can be the same ethnicity, you can come from a similar quote-unquote background, and still at the end of the day, be living an entirely different life, and that's just how culture works, that's how heritage works. No life looks exactly the same, we're not a monolith, and me trying to negotiate myself into that monolith was actually the problem. So this is towards the end, and I am wrapping up my time at the tortilla factory, and I am having my final exam, where it's going to be seen if I can speak Spanish well enough to fight off this angry customer. So here we go. The things I wanted for myself, the things I thought would make me real, a Mexican last name, Mexican customs, traditions and language. These were things that made Javier's life harder in ways I had never known. Jesse's flippantly telling me to work in construction was mean, but it had no power over me. It existed only on the plane of rhetoric, where the two of us were on an even playing field. It wouldn't hold me back, and so it bounced right off me. But it stuck for Javier. It meant something to Javier. Weeks went by, smelling of old salsa and queso, as school continued to pick up. I had become the president of like 4 different clubs, mostly because I had been the only one to raise my hand. I was the Spanish club president, the president of National Honor Society, and the editor-in-chief of the yearbook, and yet I hardly did anything because our school was mostly interested in not getting shut down by the government and avoiding hallway stabbings. I started bringing books and homework to the restaurants, and Javier would ask to take a look at them. You should quit, he told me once, leafing through my math book. You suck at this job. But before I would inevitably quit, I had my final Spanish exam. It took the form of a disgruntled customer whom Rodrigo and Javier giddily pushed me into dealing with. The customer was a short, slim woman in a halter top who wore her sunglasses indoors and had long acrylic nails. She marched her plastic tray up to the register and slammed it down. No English, her, Rodrigo said, grinning ear to ear. Go ahead. Fine, I sighed. I walked up to the counter, ready to face the final boss battle of my video game. The woman looked at me, and although I couldn't see her eyes, I could tell she was ready to behead me. Hola, I said to her. ¿Qué es tu problema? I wasn't exactly sure what she said back, but it sounded like she was methodically cursing out my ancestors one by one, plucking them individually from the branches of my family tree, generation by generation, before arriving at me. I did manage to pick up, however, that she wanted chicken tacos instead of beef. Lo siento, I said again and again in my dumb gringo accent. Voy a make tacos nuevos. I heard Rodrigo and Javier busting a gut in the kitchen. Un momento, por favor. I went back to the kitchen, punched Javier and Rodrigo, which only made them laugh harder, and made the chicken tacos. The woman, meanwhile, was still talking without me there, fighting the very memory of me. I sheepishly returned with her food. I meant to tell her they were on the house, that they were free. What I actually said, according to Javier's subsequent translation, was freedom tacos. Here, I'd said, freedom tacos. The woman, perhaps so thrown off by this that she perceived it as a power move, accepted the new tacos and went back to her table. Rodrigo and Javier practically jumped on me, applauding me and laughing so hard I thought they might fall over. For a moment, I stopped taking myself so seriously. I had utterly failed. I was having a great time. At last, my final day in the tortilla factory came. I was asked to do the most unpleasant tasks in the restaurant as a farewell gift. I walked into the sticky room where the bladders of soda were kept for the pop machine, and I cleaned the floor. Cleaned the bathrooms, and then the tables. But the worst task was carrying a vat of hot grease out to the dumpster. Javier helped me with this, yellow grease slapping up at the lip of the vat as we walked, threatening to spill over with each step. And cuidado, Wampa, he told me. I watched the snake god tattooed on his arm. It wriggled as he strained, its body covered in feathers, ancient and fierce. It was my second favorite tattoo of his. The other was the enormous Our Lady of Guadalupe he had on his back. She'd made a less than miraculous appearance once in the kitchen when Sal had accused Javier of being a dirty bastard. Javier had lifted up his shirt, turned around and said, "Say it to her." I was thinking how funny it was that these two competing gods could find a common place on Javier's body when my foot caught on a crack in the concrete. I stumbled a little, enough to spill some hot grease on Javier's arm. "Shit," he shouted. We quickly set the vat down and retreated into the shade of the building, where we sat in the grass, Javier hissing into his arm, my heart racing a mile a minute as I said, over and over, the one stupid phrase I could rely on. Lo siento, lo siento, lo siento. I still say that to Abuela sometimes in my head, hoping it will reach her wherever she is, be it heaven or hell or somewhere else. It's probably hell. I feel I want to apologize to her, like I apologized to Javier, for using her pain to validate my identity. I used to resent the fact that she didn't teach me Spanish, that she didn't maintain our family traditions. I have come to understand that her decision to ditch these things was more authentically Mexican than performing any of the rituals I thought of as real. Listening to reggaeton, making tacos, caring about a flag. Lo siento. I didn't realize how intrinsically American it was of me to think I could have an identity by having things. Spanish, tattoos, silver chains, scars. If I could do it again, panicked. I would tell myself that identity is defined as much by what you have as it is by what you've lost. Wanting to recover those things was like feeling homesick for a home I never had. That, to me, is Chicano. Lo siento. I've come to understand, panicked, that race is a lie, but it's a lie like money is a lie, which means it's real because it's a system. You can't really opt out of it. You have to play along with it to some degree, which I realized was the source of my youthful anger. I went from being American, unencumbered by identity, to realizing that I had in fact been burdened, tasked with something, and I blamed everyone around me for it. I blamed my authentically Mexican family for putting me in that situation by not preparing me, by not telling me what I was and allowing the world to surprise me with it instead. I blamed myself, too, because who was I, surrounded by all the comforts they had sacrificed to give me, to tell them they were wrong? Lo siento. The answer is, I'm no one at all, except for my experiences. I am the things I've seen and the things I've felt. And the people I've met, those things are authentic. You can't lie your way in or out of them like you can lie your way into college. Like you can lie to your white friends about whether or not the Mexican restaurant you're eating at is real, just to feel a temporary surge in authority, in authenticity. All that is to say, panicked, it's not about whether you can make tacos or not. It helps, but it's not about that. Race is a system more concerned with creating experiential differences than it is about whether or not you're really anything. Abuela and Javier taught me that. It's more important that you care about the lives and the pain of the people around you than it is for you to know how to say dick in Spanish. It's more important that you listen rather than speak. Lo siento, I said again in the shadow of the Rosas building, as if the 100th time would undo what I had done to Javier. Javier sucked his teeth. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and took a long drag. He exhaled and turned his other arm, the one that hadn't been burned, to show me. Look, he said, and I saw several scars and grease burns. This must have happened to him plenty of times before. My arms, meanwhile, had never felt so clean and unused. I'm sorry, I said in English. You know what you are? He said, locking eyes with me, his face deathly serious, my heart leaping. What? I asked. A brick, he said. I let out a cackle, relief and joy and sadness. I thought it sounded an awful lot like my abuela's. Also, this other part in that chapter that I didn't get to read, where I was in middle school and I lied about being half German, which is something that I don't know for a fact at all. And I was trying to convince my classmates that I wasn't that Mexican. And instead, they came up with this nickname, Wiener Schnitzel, which is devastatingly clever. I can't be mad at it in retrospect. It's problematic, yes, but like the level of creativity it took to arrive there is something that I have to really respect. But yeah, that is a sample of my book. If you haven't read it yet, I failed to bring a box of it with me here to Tulsa, Oklahoma, but it is available wherever books can be found.
Well, thank you for reading an excerpt. I didn't know that that's how book interviews go. So, and this is like my favorite section, and a good segue for me to like talk about like why I wanted to bring you here and why it was important that people got to hear your story. I grew up a lot like you, and in Oklahoma, with a Latino mom and grandparents, and always struggled to find people like me and stories like mine. And like, there's this thirst for finding my community, and reading your story was like just like an aha moment of like there are other people who are from here who experience very similar upbringings, and you know, people don't often think about Latinos in Oklahoma, rural Oklahoma for that matter, and I told myself, I said, if I feel this way, I can't imagine how other people will feel if they get to hear this, because our stories all stories matter, but the stories that don't get told often enough are the ones that should be told more often. So I'm excited to get started.
Yes, and I'm just so appreciative of you saying that because I live on Twitter, I live in constant fear. And so I thought for a fact that like, okay, I cannot make any we statements in this chapter. I can't say like, we Chicanos, we Mexicans, we Latin Americans or whatever, because I just knew for a fact some, Latin twink was gonna screenshot it and be like, can't believe he's speaking on our experiences this way because I don't share that, blah, blah, blah. So I was scared to really tell my story in that way. And so to have so many people be like, I saw myself in that extremely specific story I told is just so gratifying to me because yes, there's a lot that makes us different, but we do have more in common than we think sometimes. And it's just been beautiful to be able to connect with people who, aren't Chicano, who come from completely different backgrounds in Latin America and still be able to hear like, I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to be lost with yourself when it comes to identity. And yeah, it just means a lot to me to have you share that.
Well, thank you. Also, like, two thoughts that I had when I finished the book were, oh my gosh, this made me cry, and two, dang, he beat me to it. This guy told my story. I was like, okay, I just gotta write one now. Okay, so tell us like what it was like growing up in rural Oklahoma. So I grew up in South Tulsa. I'm very surrounded by privilege, kids, and you had a very different experience. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so a lot of my life, when I think about living in rural Oklahoma, I really have to parse it out from the fact that I lived with such a strange, offbeat family for being in rural Oklahoma. So like, not only were we in sort of like a mixed household where like, as I said, my white family kind of pieced out except for my dad. And my poor father, he just becomes the piñata for my entire family. Like he's like the one white guy. And so every time we get bored and there's nothing to say, it's like, let's just pick on Steven for being white. Which I think is like so funny. And he puts up with it, you know, he's a good sport about it. But also my family, they were so open-minded, and my mom was so invested in me traveling from a young age. Like she was just dead set on getting me introduced to the rest of the world by hook or by crook. So I remember like the first trip I took was to New York City. I was in the 4th grade, and I was, like many gay children, I had burgeoning anxiety, and so I screamed almost the whole time. I thought that like things were gonna fall on me from the sky, because when I got there and I see these huge tall buildings, mind you, with window units, I'm like, one of those is going to fall on me and kill me. And I expressed this to my mother, and she was like, what is wrong with you? And I was like, what if we get robbed, mother? Like I only knew the New York that I'd seen in movies, and I had seen, I believe it was either the Out-of-Towners or the Honeymooners or something. Anyway, they get robbed in New York City. And I was so certain, so utterly certain that we would step out of that cab and I would immediately be shot. Like, because, you know, the only context I hadn't even seen a big city outside of Oklahoma City anywhere, much less New York City. But, you know, she dragged me to the art museums. She said, look at this. She bought me a whole lot of books to read about the lives of artists. I read Factory Girl when I was in middle school, which is a so my mother did sort of like set up having a gay son, I think. She was very invested in it. I think if I was straight, she would have just been like, okay, that's fine, do what you want to do, I guess. She was very invested in me being a creative as well, so I had a knack for drawing when I was little. One of the first gifts I ever got was an Etch-a-Sketch, and I immediately just started drawing this like gun. And my mom was like, look, he's talented. He's doing something. Yeah, it's okay, we have to feed this. So she got me all the sketchbooks I ever wanted, and she got me all the like information that I would ever want about how creatives lived. All that did end up coming, however, with that like Mexican-American Chicana, like, okay, you can do this, but you gotta be the best at it. You have to be really good at it. One example that I have to give on that is that very recently, one of the life-changing things that this book brought into my life, my mom also had me read Me Talk Pretty One Day by David Sedaris, like before I was in high school. So like, I don't know what the hell was going on in that book when I was in middle school. I was just like, okay, this is some very sad homosexual man living his life, and it's very funny. It's kind of what I got out of it. But his books were so influential to me. They were huge. And my mom was the one who loved him and who brought his books to me and made sure that those were some of the first books I ever read. And in format, it was a similar book to my book. And so I got this email from my publisher being like, David Sedaris has requested a copy of your book. And I was like, oh my God. And I was so excited. And I called my mom and I was like, David Sedaris asked my publisher for my book. And she was like, can you not buy one? It's a very Mexican mom thing. And like this is a man that she worshipped when like he was some like big time author, but now that he's like associated with me, he's like, he can spend money, I don't know, like he's rich. He ended up like posting my book on Instagram and being like, this is an amazing book, blah blah blah. And I was so happy. And the first person I called was not my mother, because I was like, what shady thing is this woman going to say about this? But yeah, all that is to say that my rural experience was queered, shall we say, by the fact that I had this eccentric Mexican mother who was just like very hell-bent on getting me all this like cosmopolitan information, which made me a very strange rural child. I felt very different, not just for my like, you know, burgeoning gayness or whatever, that was certainly part of it, but also just like, I mean, like I said, I was reading things and watching things that kind of set me apart from my classmates who were very keen on like quoting, what's his face, Jeff Foxworthy. Like, you might be a redneck if, like that sort of thing. That was huge. That was huge, as was Eminem, who frightened me. Very scared of that man in middle school. But it was bizarre. I felt out of place the whole time. I can't sit here and pretend like I was like, you know, I was a coal miner's daughter, and that's exactly what I was doing. I knew everything. I was working with my hands. I was like, you know, tending to the crops or something. That would be a more compelling narrative for me in New York, certainly. But the reality is that I always stuck out like a sore thumb in my rural environment. And there's a certain genre of human in rural environments, and you can pick them out very easily whose eyes are just over here somewhere, and everyone else is very like present, and they're all strange, and you can tell that they're just itching to leave. So I did leave as soon as I possibly could, and that was something that I always knew was going to happen, and my parents always knew was going to happen. It's just like, yeah, you don't belong here. So I felt very nourished by it, and I'm very nowadays happy that I have it because it is an alternative point of view, and I think that the more you're othered in life, unfortunately, it does expand your worldview. It does make you see things and think of things a little differently. And I think it impacted my storytelling. I think that unfortunately I was very influenced by country music and by Reba McEntire. Like I remember it when I heard Fancy for the first time. I was like, that's a good story, actually. I mean, it's just that like, it's that way of telling a story that's very straightforward. You're not trying to do any fancy flourishes or whatever. You're just talking about what it felt like that friend at a bar is giving you a little heart-to-heart conversation. That really impacted me. It felt very down to earth. And sometimes I try to write like my contemporaries who I love do. They do these wild, poetic, like out there queer musings about life, and I'm just like, I don't know. Here's the story of me getting on Grindr. So it did influence me for better and for worse. And in the end, I'm grateful for it. But I would not move back to my family's farm. I'm happy that they have that, and it's not for me.
So, like, who did you look up to as a kid?
Tyra Banks. I watched a lot of America's Next Top Model where they were doing these like jigsaw-esque things to these poor women. It was just like buzzing their hair off. They're just being like, you want to be America's Next Top Model? You need a gap in your teeth. like drill it out of them and stuff. And I was like, this seems horrible, but I was also just like respectful of this woman who was the god of her universe, where it was like, if I tell you, you need to physically change yourself, that's what you're going to do. I had fantasies of Tyra Banks coming out to my neck of the woods and casting for her junior America's Next Top Model, which is a very grim thought for a child to have. Where I was like, and mind you, I was like pretty ugly, but I'm unique looking. I have something to offer this world. That's where my thoughts were at, unfortunately, for a really long time. I didn't get a whole lot of like, wow, I really see myself in that person, just because my media intake was very limited. I watched a whole lot of Nick at Night, so it was my sister and I watching a lot of Three's Company, watching a lot of like the George Lopez show, who I did not see myself fellow Mexican, but like the life they had set up in that show was very like California, and I'm very Tex-Mex, and those are also different worlds. Because I had no neighbors, a lot of my relationship with the world was through television, and so the people I looked up to were just people who lived in a city and had their silly little lives going, and they made little crises out of ridiculous things, where it was just like, Monica hasn't arrived at the shoot yet. Where is she? What's going on? Just like this frazzled twink, just like on the phone, just like, where is she? Where's Monica? It was like, oh, I could live that way. That's ahead of me, I think. I can move to a city and dye my hair bleach blonde and, have fake panic attacks over where Monica is, and she's late for a shoot, and I have to like get her here or else I'm fired. That was it. That was really it. I think in terms of like my first moral, actual like, wow, I want to be you one day. Maybe I've just never experienced that, because most people I meet and I'm like, thank God I'm not you. Like, I'm glad you're doing you, I'm doing me.
No, but
it works.
That's great though. I mean, like, you're honest about that. I mean, like, most queer kids, we like, our role models or the people we look up to are like these powerful women on reality TV,
yes.
or on TV shows.
Yes.
And you're like, I don't know, I relate to them, I don't know why, but it's like, we're looking for something more to like identify with.
Did you ever see Gotta Kick It Up with America Ferrera?
No.
Gotta Kick It Up is this really problematic Disney movie where this white lady moves into this heavily Mexican neighborhood in California, and she's a dance teacher. And they have a little like cheer squad there, and she's like, I'm gonna whip these brown kids into shape, and they're gonna learn how to dance, and we're gonna go to the cheer finals or whatever. And America Ferrera is the best dancer among them, but she's like a thicker girl, and so she has the moves and the passion, but not the body. And so like she gets shamed for it. She's like, I'm not helping y'all with the final cheer meet or whatever, but she shows up at the last minute and saves them through the power of her moves.
I'm just like a busy story.
I was like, I've got to be a cheerleader. This is something that happened to me, unfortunately, a lot. The whole reason I think I pursued journalism was because I was in yearbook in high school. I worked in the Photoshop department, and I did our book cover and stuff like that. We won some awards for it that year. And there was this lady who was working for the local Mormon news, and she couldn't be less interested in us. She was wearing this like fabulous long coat, and she was checking herself in her compact, and she had her little notebook on the side where every once in a while she would do like this, clearly to be like, area rural kids come up to OU for their big yearbook meet or whatever. It was fun was had by all or whatever. And I was just like, I want to be you. I want to be this like disinterested, dispassionate, fabulous woman who writes stories for the paper. And that led me to NBC News. Years later.
My own American Forever story.
We all have one.
Loved watching Ugly Betty as a teenager.
Yes.
And I was like, her cousin, or her nephew.
The little gay one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Justin. I can't say anything, but I didn't want to be Betty. I was in love with her boss, and I wanted to be.
You wanted to be Wilhelmina Slater.
I wanted to be Wilhelmina. Like, yes.
That is so telling. and powerful. I'm so happy to hear you say that.
She's not the villain. She's the hero.
Exactly. She has her own story to tell.
So kind of switching like tone, you talk about a lot of like serious things and in your book, and you're very vulnerable, and it's just in a world where there's so much like superficialness in like the things we post online or the things we tell other people. So like getting to know you over the past few days, and I've just like seen like how genuine a person you are, and I could feel your soul in like the book. One thing that like really like hurt me, but also like moved me, was when you were talking about your experience in middle school with your bully, and where to start with that, other than like how reflecting on that as an adult, like, and talking about in your book, like what was that like experience like for you?
Yeah, so obviously as a child it was hell, just because your world is so small as a child. Even if you technically know there are other places in the world that you could go where you might even be celebrated, the visceral knowledge isn't there, it doesn't live in the body, it lives in the mind, and so it almost doesn't matter, because every single day you're going to this school and people are calling you a faggot, people are calling you all sorts of things. And not only that, the name calling is one thing, but also I think the most impactful thing for me was the knowledge of just being policed and patrolled in that way, where every little thing you do could result in a negative outcome. And obviously this is like partly scientific. If you do something and get shocked for it, for example, you're going to learn, okay, this thing is bad. And that's why I think it was so heavy on me, is because if I showed any part of my little personality that I had going on, and when you're a kid, it's a baby plant. You're just supposed to water it, give it sunlight. It hasn't become itself yet. You're supposed to try to figure it out. You're supposed to make mistakes. You're supposed to spread out where you can and see what happens. And that process for me was very much disrupted. It was very much an act of having to obscure a lot and having to keep things behind a curtain a lot, because I knew, if I wear one little thing that steps out of line with what a boy is supposed to wear, I'm going to hear about it. I'm going to get told awful things, and no one is going to stop those people from saying awful things to me. And that is raw information going into the brain of a child, where it's just like, something's wrong, you've got to fix it. And I think that was way worse. And I think it is also a personality-based thing, and we don't really talk about that a whole lot, but I knew, for example, there was this one guy, one solitary person in my hometown in Cache, Oklahoma, who was out and gay, and he just knew instinctively what to do to survive, and that was to become this extremely over-the-top caricature of what a gay person is. And so people knew not to really mess with him because he was funny. He was like out there and he was outlandish, and it was just like he was sort of their joke punching bag, but that was a purpose he served. And what I learned as a kid is like you've got to find a purpose where people leave you alone. You've got to find a role to play where people accept you. And me not having that was horrible. Because like I mentioned in the book that the guy who bullied me, it felt so unfair because on his first day of school he was wearing this pink hoodie. And I was like, okay, you're going to get it. Like, they're going to get you for this. You can't just wear pink as a boy in this school. But because he made people laugh, because he was so outgoing, and because people wanted to be his friend, next thing you know, other boys are wearing pink to school. And I'm like, what the hell? This was not the rule set up for me. And so you get this feeling of like, oh, I get it. It's me that's the problem. I'm the issue. I'm wired incorrectly. And that feeling stays with you much longer than the material circumstances around you because, you move away from your bullies, that part of your history gets buried a little bit. You forget that visceral feeling of feeling sick to your stomach when you go to school every day, of asking your dad, can I stay in the car because I don't want to be there early because I don't want to interact with anyone. You forget all those sorts of things, little behaviors that you pick up to get through every single day. But what stays with you is this idea, this knowledge that I can be punished for doing the wrong thing. And the wrong thing often looks like being myself or just being who I am. And you develop coping mechanisms around that. The human brain has all these interesting ways that it tries to protect you that are indistinguishable from it enacting violence on you every day, where it's just sounding the panic alarm if someone says something slightly jokey about you. That's something I used to have, where in high school and college, if someone made a little like ribby joke at me, which is something boys love to do, my brain was like, this person is attacking me. You've got to either cut them off, you've got to say something worse back. It was rough. It was really rough. And that whole chapter for me is me being this out gay man in New York City, working at Condé Nast, having my own desk, having this advice column that's going really well, and just going back to my hometown and going physically back to that school so that I could go there and be like, ha, you stupid school, I'm better than you now. Like, I have more Twitter followers than there are people in this town. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Flex.
That's flex on these hoes, exactly. And then life not giving you that, because you go and you realize, my God, this is just a building. It is not this like looming monument to dread in Mordor that I had in my head. It's not this like fiery pit where you've finally gotten strong enough to beat it and you can now declare victory over it. I'm like, this is a school. This is a regular ass school with regular ass kids where normal things probably happen every single day. And I felt very silly because I was this full grown man walking around, everything is like yay high to me. You know what I mean? And I'm here to beat it up, right? So I'm just like, how dare you do what you did to me? And the lesson I ended up drawing from that, the big rabbit motif that I have in my book, I also have, as a tangent, I'll explain this later, but my author picture is me with a rabbit as well, is that there was this pebbled wall in my middle school where when I was a little loser that was getting called faggot every day, I would hide by the wall and I would look for shapes in it, and that was my big game that I would play with myself to waste time until school started. And one of the shapes that I could reliably find every single time was this ugly, droopy-faced rabbit. And so I specifically went back to that school that hot summer day while I was working for Condé Nast, Anna Wintour telling me to get out of the elevator, very fabulous, that sort of thing. To go back and to find that same rabbit and be like, I'm looking at the same thing now, this landmark, and I'm better than it now. I don't need it anymore. I've surpassed my circumstances of needing these faces in this wall. And me, again, a grown-ass man, looking for shapes in this wall and not finding that stupid rabbit. Like looking for it all over the place and not being able to see it. And the takeaway for me of the bullying chapter is just like, I'm looking at this thing with different eyes. I'm looking at this thing from a different experience, from a different perspective. Because although I've carried this story with me all these years, the story of me being traumatized, the story of me being tormented, the reality is I was changing all that time. I was becoming a completely different person who sees the world differently. And I found that to be very comforting because to me it was like, I don't have perfect CCTV footage, a perfect record of the horrible things that happened to me in this school.
I have my understanding of it. I have my story about it. And I live and die like most humans do by the stories I tell myself. And if that's the case, and if that narrative isn't as reliable as I thought it was, then that must mean that I am an author over it in some way. Because I make the case throughout the book, I think the thing that ties all the stories together is this idea that memory is an act of creation. It has an element of creative writing to it. It has an element of you telling the story you want or need to hear in that moment. And so for me, it was a moment when I didn't find that rabbit to be like, can I tell a different story? Can I look at it a different way? Can I find new shapes in my past to live by? Because the one I'm living by right now isn't serving me anymore. I don't need it anymore. Is there something I can do here to just change the narrative up a little bit? And I think that, writing the book itself was an act in that way, because I was just like, I want to tell this story as best I know how. I know that all I can do is like recreate the shapes of it. I don't have the perfect dialogue. I don't have every single little thing that happened. I have my understanding of it, and I think my understanding of it now is a better one than I had when I was a child, when I was in high school, when I was in college. I've grown, and I know how to take agency over the things that have happened to me, and I think that is a powerful thing and something I really wanted to share in the book. So with the bullying, it was like, you never want to make the simple case of like, bad things happened to me, therefore I became a better person. I don't think it works that way. I think it works that way when you understand that no matter what's happened to you, there is an element of agency you can find in there, and it's all comes down to narrative at the end of the day.
Yeah, you touched on like, going back, and you're like, what, it's just a regular old school, like, it's not this big scary thing. I tell you, as someone who went back to an elementary school and seen the comings and goings of these kids, they have their own rules, it's like a little society, and it's a make it or break it. And, there are little Donovids and little JPs, and it's so interesting to just, like, oh my gosh, like, that kid was me. And, like, you have this, like, hindsight, it's like, oh my gosh, like, these kids are jerks.
No, I openly identify as terrified of children. I think they're so scary. Because they'll say anything. They don't care. They will say any old thing. So every time sometimes I'll have to interact with a child, and I hope they can't pick up on my fear. I'm just like, hey, buddy, I'm going to go over here now. Like that sort of thing.
It's interesting that I love kids, and, going back and getting to being influenced was like, oh, I get to, like, help change, like, their stories. I get to be that, like, that superhero that they didn't have, that I didn't have, that person who gets to save JP or Donovid, in those moments. Like, you were very honest about your anxiety. I'm like, man, this guy, like, very, very smart. Are people noticing this one small thing about me? Like, because not only you're gay, you're like, you're Latino, and you're like, there's a big target on you of just like, I am different, so therefore I have to do my best to fit in. Something that you talked about that I was just like really profound to me was you say you wondered, like, from the book, say you wondered being bullied in the first place because of your own masculinity. Like, why did you frame it like that?
Yeah. I'm super interested throughout the book about what masculine expectations look like. And it became very apparent to me in my hometown that the mere act of being bullied means that you're failing at being a man, because a man would fight back, would stick up for himself. So it became even harder for me to address it, like with my parents, for example, because I was like, this just confirms that I'm not the right kind of boy, I'm not the right kind of man later in my life. And I found that so interesting, pairing it with the idea of being an advice columnist, I guess. This idea of like, the advice columnist is supposed to tell you how to live in the general direction of correctness. They're supposed to tell you like, here's what you should do, here's how you should be. Obviously it's way more complicated than that. But I found an interesting parallel there in authority, in sort of narrative authority, where it's just like, here's what a boy should be. Here's how being a correct person looks like for you. And failing at that feels horrible. And for me, a lot of my turmoil that I was in came from the fact that I just couldn't force this being that I'm piloting, this life that I have, couldn't force it into the quote-unquote right kind of way, right kind of person, right kind of young boy. And if that had been on the table for me, we would be having an entirely different conversation, obviously. There is an element of not having a choice because you get good at hiding things. You get good at, putting a little drape over something, but you never quite learn how to actually bodily become this thing you're trying to become. And I think at the end of the day, that's what a lot of masculinity is, even for people who aren't gay. For all kinds of men, it's this completely unattainable ideal where here's everything you're expected to do. And I think that task list does something to people, and I think it makes them less willing to share things, less willing to express emotions, less willing to engage in vulnerability at the end of the day. Because vulnerability is an opening. Vulnerability is sometimes an act of trust. It is an act of, and some would perceive it as surrender. And it is something that we teach boys and men not to engage in. And I learned that very quickly, that any time I showed a little window of my true self, that was leaving me open for fire. And I have to imagine that, let's say you're not a young little gay boy, let's say you're just some boy who likes something that the other boys don't like, you too can be treated like a little gay boy in that moment. Because, mind you, I wasn't out there identifying as gay in middle school. I wasn't like, yeah, I'm a gay man, I'm not going to hide it or whatever. I'm a homosexual, but I don't feel like telling him, I'm going to keep it secret. I myself thought, there's no way I'm gay. I'm not, going to be a gay person. I'm just listening to Kelly Clarkson a lot. Like, these are the ways you think as a child sometimes, where it's just like, break away, it's such a bottom. But it's just an unwillingness to give anyone a square inch into that part of yourself that you're trying to keep hidden, that you're trying to not give the world because you know the world can punish you for it. And so I think in the book, I'm trying to make the case that this isn't good for men either. That even if you're not gay, even if you're not Latino, where we have this, a lot of people want to talk about machismo a lot. I'm not entirely convinced that Latinos have even more toxic masculinity than, say, other cultures do. It feels kind of regular manness sometimes. But, regardless of whether you share my exact intersection of identities or whatever, it is the case that I think the way we ask men to become these unfeeling creatures is bad for literally everyone.
Absolutely. When I was reading your book, I was thinking about how different things are. We're very similar, and we got bullied for just being different. My thing was, I was very just outgoing. I was like, I know what I'm gonna do, and they stamp that out of you. They stamp that out of you, and we're now living in a time where kids have more access to information than you or I ever had, and there's a different acceptance, for them. But kids are still getting bullied. We have a youth program here, and I've seen it grow. And interesting perspective for me is just these kids don't even know how awesome their current reality is from ours, the one that we were teenagers and middle schoolers in, and it's so nice to get to see the labors of the leader or career leaders who have worked really hard to make queer spaces. And the thing I was wondering if you had thought about was, do you think things would have been different if you had the people who are supposed to protect you and look out for you had done something, Because now there are allies and teachers, there are resources for teachers to be better equipped to handle those things. And back then, that wasn't even in the periphery at all. So
I do think that one constant over the many, many years has at least been you have an ally in the woman English teacher.
Yes, English
teachers. The school librarian.
Yes.
Mine was this woman.
Nail on the head, nail on the head.
There was this woman named Miss Bullock, and she was just had this plumpy eye makeup, deeply divorced, loved her. And sometime I would just eat lunch with her, and we would kiki a little bit. And that was my friend. You know what I mean? And
Same with my mom, who, by the way, was my 9th grade English teacher. That was great. I still have a reaction to a red ink on a paper, because she would just bleed my papers, so they were just red all over it. Like, you did this wrong, you did that. That's not a word. She still does that. Like, sometimes I'll be talking to her over the phone, and I will say snuck instead of sneak, and out of the corner of my mouth, she's like, not a word. Okay. Sorry. But she also, like, in our high school, had this little, like, LGBT culture around her, where they were just like little gay boys would just come be her assistants, and she would tell me after school, she was like, "Oh, what did you do for lunch today?" And I would tell her, she's like, "Oh, I had lunch with Jonathan again." I'm like, "Jonathan Lacaba?" And she's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "My classmates? Where did you go?" She's like, "Moved to Wayne's," which is like the little burger place off campus. And I'm like, "Why are you doing that?" She's like, "He's funny, I like him." And he's like this little like burgeoning twink who's just, "Oh, I just love your mom. It's fine."
You raise a good point. I mean, like, even if you're not actually thinking about that, you find that one person, even if like silently they don't know that you're queer or know anything about your identity.
Yeah.
They're like your person.
Well, I think that like nowadays these people have stickers to put on their wall. They're just like, "This is a safe space. This is an ally." And back then, all we had was like, it's really gay hair that you have in this bowl. Like, it's just like this huge like, 80s sort of like nimbus cloud on her head. You just feel intrinsically safe. It was all vibe based, you know.
Like,
It's
I
like,
tell you, teachers know you're gay when they write "pleasure to teach."
oh, absolutely. A pleasure to have in class. Yes. And I think that being good at English is a pretty gay trait. Where it's just like, if you're like making A's, when the practice is like, "Oh, use this word in a sentence," and I was just really good at that. And Miss Bauman was just like, "Oh, it was a really good sentence you said today." And you just want to be like, "I'm gay." Like immediately sight unseen. It's a sacred bond, I think, between the LGBT kids and the English departments. Yeah, I think it's cool that like nowadays we have more like formal ways to signal this is a place where you should feel safe. This is a place where you can talk to me. In fact, we offer oftentimes training to people to be better at talking about these sorts of things, and that is something that in my wildest dreams I couldn't imagine. Like, I think I was telling you the other day, a few years ago, probably like 3 years ago, I went back to my high school, which is very different from my middle school. My middle school was very rural, out in the countryside. I would go 30 minutes by car because my mom was a teacher at the school in the city. We called it Flaughton. She taught English there, and so the school district allowed me to go to Lawton High with her, and it was way more diverse. It was way bigger, but obviously still not very accepting of gay people. And 3 years ago, I got an email, a really surprising one from Lawton High, being like, "We would love for you to come and talk to our very first like GSA, like our Rainbow Club or whatever." And I remember the school near us had a like Rainbow Club or whatever. Eisenhower, you know, in Oklahoma towns and cities, we take football rivalries very seriously.
Yes.
So it's just like LHS versus Ike is the big thing. Yes, it's a huge deal. And I remember that like in our pep rallies even, and in like the weeks leading up to the big game, a big talking point for them would be like, "Oh, Ike is full of fairies because they have that Rainbow Club or whatever," and it would be this huge talking point about how ridiculous Eisenhower was and how fruity Eisenhower was, and their team can't be all that because they have like this Rainbow Club. Stuff like that was very much happening when I was in high school. And so for Lawton High to have a Rainbow Club of its own, and when I went and I met this young gay person who was wearing a helmstooth cape and he was wearing a matching helmstooth hat, I was like, how? Wow, this is amazing. This is incredible. I didn't want to like weird him out with being like, this is incredible, this is amazing, oh my god, I just want to know everything about you. I just like try to play it cool because you know no one wearing a cape wants you to like be uncool around them, I think. He probably has all his shit together, and I didn't want to be like that lame adult who was just like, "I love your cape." But he was just walking around like he owned the place, and I was like, this is wonderful. So much can happen in such a short amount of time. It's nice.
Did you see this good, relevant, like, so they rebooted Gossip Girl.
Yes.
And like some of like the main characters are queer and queer people's color, and like they're like the villains. I'm like, wow, we've reached that point now where we're we're the main characters, and we're not like the nerd or the one who's getting bullied. We're the ones who are bullying.
Oh, it'll be so nice when we get to the level where we can actually see like us bully each other on screen. Like we're not like the queer-coded villain, and we're not like the perfect martyr where it's like our goodness is intrinsic because we're a minority or whatever. It's just like I want to see some good old-fashioned cat fighting, you know, between the gays on the big screen in a big way, in a well-funded film with queer people behind the camera as well as in front of it. That will be amazing, and those things are pretty rare still, but it's cool to see that it's more and more common every day.
Yeah. So one of the things was, when I read your book, I was like, okay, like I want to be like JP, and I want to like write a book like this one day. And about a year ago, I got to talk with Roberto Gonzalez. He wrote Butterfly Boy. It was like his memoir, and it was so interesting to talk to him. And I like threw things in there. I was just like, wow, like he has come from so nothing to like this very like profound and notable author. Like, who are some of the like Latinx authors that like were poets or leaders that like have inspired you, and like this is like what motivates me to like keep writing or to keep being this like influence in literary.
Yeah, so like most Mexicans in diaspora, the first Mexican book I came across was Blessing Ultima. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
I was like, wow, what am I reading right now? This is
It's intense.
Yes, really intense. And it was interesting because my experience with literature was pretty bizarre in that, as I said before, my mom was feeding me these really wild books, but also I spent a lot of time in the library, and so I would just pick whatever jumped out at me. So I very much was that person who picked things by cover. And so the first book I read that really expanded my mind in this like wild, wonderful, queer way is this book called Door into Ocean, and I don't even know, but like the author's name is very hard to pronounce, and it was just this outlandish sci-fi novel about a planet of lesbian catfish people, and they're called the Sharers, and they're being invaded by a planet of men, and the men have all these like Star Wars-esque technologies, and it's up to the Sharers to kind of like, how do we use our biotechnology and nature to repel these like invading men from the man planet? And I was hooked. I was just like, I love these lesbian catfish, these are my friends. And I was just like, and that's really what literature, I think, at its best does, is that it really just gives you this portal that you can just soak your brain in for a while. You can go somewhere else entirely. I mean, my literary career as a reader has been me putting myself in the shoes of people who have nothing to do with me. I have been, in reading a book, I've been behind the eyes of white women, I've been behind European men, people in countries I've never visited, people who are straight even, it got that exotic. And I never once thought that I didn't have the power to empathize with them or to feel the things they were feeling, to pick up the emotions that the writer or the character was trying to give me. And so for me, I never once doubted in my life that I would be unable to give that to someone else writing from my experiences. And so when I started reading more Latinx authors, it wasn't like, oh, finally I found my people. Yes, there were things in those books that made me feel like, oh, wow, I've never seen this in a book before. It's incredible. Yes, it is exactly how we act in these situations. But I tend to see literature as more of this like huge global community thing that we all sort of share and that we're all sort of able to partake in. It's just that certain people haven't been given adequate resources, haven't been given the fair share of the pie, haven't been given the opportunity to gift that to other people as well. And so when I first started reading books that kind of were closer to my experience, be that gay books or Chicano books, it just reinforced my feeling of like, I really need to write a book one day. That was always my main goal. I really want to tell some stories that people who are nothing like me can read them and be like, wow, I felt that, or I laughed at that, or I cried at that. That's the most sacred thing, I think, that literature can give a person. And so, nowadays, a lot of these Latinx authors are just people who I kind of know. And it's just been so wild to take people's names, like, John Paul Brammer right here, and take that out and put them at like a do it. That has been one aspect of publishing a book that I wasn't expecting, and one that I feel giddy about, because I get to ask people, what made you want to write a book? What is your background as a reader? Which I always find to be an interesting question, because before you write anything, you're reading stuff. And that really impacts a lot of what you end up writing. And a lot of us didn't grow up reading books that come from people who are anything like us. And I think that is such an interesting situation to be in. And one that I hope that maybe even books like mine or books like, maybe yours one day, can help remedy, because we need those stories out in the world, not only for people who are in our community, but people who aren't in our community who need to be told and shown, yes, it's possible to feel the things we're feeling as well.
Yeah, empathy is so important. Although I related to it because, we share, queer, Latino, I feel like there are very shared experiences in there that a lot of people can relate to, being different, not fitting in, and it's so important to have your stories like yours, because it highlights things that everyone goes through, and I think that's why it's very relatable, and that's what I love about it. It's just I feel like I'm talking to my best friend, and they're spilling some good cheese in it, and that's what I loved. So I don't know if most people know that John Paul, he's a kind of a he has notoriety on Twitter. My introduction to John Paul was on Twitter when I was a 20-year-old, 26, almost 27 now, and I just loved his very frank and just says it whatever is on his mind. I was just this guy is very interesting, and I like this guy. I want to be it, and people listen to what he says, and people are want to know what you have to say. And so my question that I have here is what's it like to have that notoriety for be someone that people look to for your opinion?
Well, I will say my relationship with social media started out super fun, because there is a really sweet sliver of time where you've written a few things, you've got maybe 2,000 followers, somewhere around there, and everyone just wants to be why is no one paying attention to this amazing writer? And the stuff you're putting out is yes, we need to stop paying attention to this person and start paying more attention to that person. And I could say whatever the hell I wanted when I had 2,000 followers. I was adding everyone. I had nothing to lose, everything to gain. And it was just a place where I thought I could engage in fun little prompts every day. Because every day there's something in the news, something wild going on, and you have your chance to say something clever about it, something insightful about it, something interesting about it. And I think one thing I really shine in is voice. So a lot of my writing relies really heavily on a unique voice that's able to translate tone pretty well. I like those sharp corner turns between something sad and something funny. I like the sentences being smushed up together where it's am I supposed to laugh at this? I can't tell. I really love stuff like that. And Twitter is so compatible with that way of thinking and writing that when I actually started to take off on it, it felt really good. Also, Twitter is extremely adept at feeding off of your need for attention and that validation loop. So it's you get 200 retweets and maybe some verified author who is so far out of your reach that you've always loved retweets it, and you're oh my god, she noticed me, that sort of feeling. You get hooked on it very quickly. And then when I started building, more of my following, and I got verified, and my book started coming out, and I reached some critical mass of followers, you stop getting seen as a person. You start getting seen as this other kind of entity that you can just say whatever you want to. And so for me, Twitter is an interesting place where I don't know if I could do the work I'm doing without it, because that is where a lot of my audience lives, and it has given me so much, because when I was in rural Oklahoma, I couldn't afford to take an internship on the coasts. I couldn't go to I'm in 30 Rock for a year now, and I'm going to write X number of stories, and I'm going to help this person edit their stuff. I didn't have that. Couldn't afford it, didn't know how to apply to it, didn't know what to do. I had Wi-Fi, I had social media, and I could pitch to people on Twitter. And so my first job I got through Twitter. My second job I got through Twitter. When I interviewed for this really amazing job at NBC, my Twitter following was a huge part of it, where they were like, if he tweets a story out, people are going to notice it.
The power of the internet.
The power of the internet. And I will say, too, that there's been a lot of good with it, where I've met a lot of amazing people from social media. It's a great way to meet your community in places that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to because they live in different cities, different countries. It's great for that. But it's nowadays I try to tweet as much gibberish as I humanly possibly can, because if I get perceived on Twitter for even a moment, it's open season. And for better or for worse, you know, there are people who love what you have to say. You're way more likely to be exposed to people who hate what you have to say. People who kind of have nothing better to do but sort of dig into like who you are. So I've had people try to like get the exact ratio of like native Mexican blood to like Spanish blood running through my veins because like this guy was like, oh my god, I matched with him on Tinder years ago and we talked about being Mexican. Here's who I think his grandmother is, and here's how like dark she is versus how light this person is. And I was just like, this is bonkers. This is coconuts. This is not like a way we're meant to live, you know, where you have people trying to pick apart every little piece of you all the time. And so now I'm trying to really iron out what my relationship to it is. And then right now I think it's like there is a voice in the back of my head that composes tweets, and my job is to keep it from winning. I have to like not let it tweet. If I fail, every tweet that I make is a failure of will. Where it's just like, it is something that like demanded to be said, and every gate that I had in its way was trampled over. But I think, you know, I just keep setting those gates up, and I think that's for the better, because the less I say at this point, that's fine. You know, I try to uplift people who need it, whose stories maybe don't get as much attention. I try to say nice things about other writers I like, especially ones who don't have a huge platform, because at the end of the day, no matter how you cut it, no matter how much bad comes with it, it's a privilege, where if I have a book coming out, I don't have to worry that no one's going to know about it. Unless like what happened with Instagram happens to Twitter and it just dies one day. That could happen, and then I'll just be some guy. Maybe I'll be free even, I'll feel liberated from the whole situation. But yeah, it's a double-edged sword, for sure.
So my last question leads into another question. So, you know, you have a column and people follow your column, and you have followers on Twitter, and we were talking about kids earlier. You have like queer kids follow, like teenagers, 13, 14-year-olds.
Yeah.
Like, how do you feel about that? And then do you think you could have, what would it have been like for you if you had this platform as a queer teen?
So, Hola Papi Inc. has two major camps in terms of the people who read it and read me. One camp are the bi teen girls with blue hair. They are my strongest soldiers. They are the people who will buy my book no matter what. They are the people who write into the column most often. I have a lot of like bi and lesbian drama happening to the point where like there was this minor kerfuffle the other day where someone wrote into my column being like, and I wanted to ask a fellow lesbian about this, and I was like, okay, continue, I guess. So those people read Hola Papi, and then the second category of people who read Hola Papi are cis hetero moms. Okay? And they are the most likely to reach out and apologize to me for reading. And they'll be like, hey, I know I'm like a cis straight white lady, and I'm a mom, but I love your book. And I'm like, none of that needed an apology, actually. Like, it's great, you read my book, that's awesome. Those are the people I hear from the most, because notoriously gay men steal, they don't buy. So my book, it's like it was from like their Grindr hookup probably, I don't know. I actually got a message, like my friend was like, oh, I got your book. I'm like, where'd you get it? And like the nightstand of this guy. That's amazing.
Yes.
Trixie Mattel also said, you know, don't make gay men your core market because they will not buy your stuff. Which I can't wait to see if the data bears that out. You know, I get like a trickle of it every once in a while. I get to see who's actually reading me. Because my book publisher, Simon & Schuster, they pitched like, can we like remove the tank top on here because it might be gayer that way, it might attract more gay men, and I'm just like, sweetie, some bad news in terms of my core demographic, and I had to explain that the bi teen girls who run anime clubs in high school are the ones who are reading my book, and I love them, and I would die for them.
They're powerful.
They're very strong. They're very strong. Yes. So yeah, I do know that a lot of queer teen people specifically read me, and that's like a wide brush of people. You know, like a lot of like young gay kids, young lesbian kids, young trans kids, and what I've learned is that it's better that I try not to cater everything I write to them because that will make me uncool.
Yeah.
Because if I start being like, hey kids, thanks for reading my stuff, this is written just for you, they'll be like, thanks. They like it when it's like, it's for adults, but they're reading it, if that makes any sense. Like, and I relate to that being like a high schooler. I don't want to be the person who's like reading the book that was like, oh, this is the big YA title of the day, don't you want it? Here, have it. It's better if there's like a certain layer of like, I'm doing my thing, they're doing their thing. But when we meet, it's always beautiful and wonderful. When I get letters from them, it really makes me emotional because it reminds me. Also, high school looks completely differently than it looks like for me now. Like there are lesbian high schoolers with like drama that needs a spread, like a flow chart or a spreadsheet because there's so much going on. I'm like, how are there 20 lesbians at your school? And you're all out and you're all toxic in really beautiful ways, but like toxic in the way that you can only be if you are out and proud. You know what I mean? Like that has nothing to do with being closeted, everything to do with being a horrible person. I love it. It's beautiful. It's great. So I think that they're living. They've almost caught up with me basically. So I'm hesitant to like really say anything as if like, oh, it's so beautiful that I can talk to these kids now. It's like they're in the room with me. They're living a life that looks eerily similar to mine.
It truly encapsulates that phrase. It's like either die here or live long enough to see yourself become a villain. And
No,
it's
yeah,
just like,
it's just like I almost want to ask them for advice sometimes, where it's just like, you probably know things that I don't know because you were out and about in ways that I wasn't at your age. You're probably garnering life experiences that I can only dream of, and there's a conversation needs to happen there. I think that the PapiCon, when I eventually become popular enough to have one, we will all sit down together and I'll be like, lesbians, let's talk. What's going on? Yeah, like I want to know everything.
So one of the things that I found really amusing in your book, but it's also like kind of, oh, I totally get this. You say that when you created your column, you didn't set out to be the Latino Harvey Milk. And let me say that, like, I have said I want to be like I want to be gay Latino Harvey Milk.
Why didn't I say Harvey Lynch?
Missed opportunity.
That would have been better.
So with that though, like, who did you want to be, and what impact did you want your writing to have?
So yeah, the book kind of goes into detail about me not wanting to be an advice columnist, but the point that what happened is I was working two jobs at once. I was working for NBC News, and I was working for this like devil gay man from Prague who would give me assignments over Skype to recap gay porn. And I had very little time between those things to do anything else. But I needed more checks to survive in Brooklyn and, again, not move back to my family's farm in Oklahoma. So when my friend, Matthew Rodriguez, was like, hey, I'm working for this new magazine. It's Grindr's doing it. I'm like, Grindr? Yes, Grindr. They have a digital magazine, and we're looking for contributors. Would you like to do something maybe weekly or monthly? And so in my head, I'm like, weekly checks is better than monthly checks. I should come up with a column that I can write once a week. But I'm like sleep deprived. I'm crying on the M train, writing Teen Vogue articles about Kylie Jenner's fidget spinner. Where I'm like, matches were dressed. There's like blood running down my face. I'm just openly weeping on my way to 30 Rock. So I was like, okay, I'm very stressed. I can't think of a new thing to write about every single week. I need a prompt to come to me. And that is how I thought, an advice column will work great because, you know, gay drama is an inexhaustible resource. There will always be something new. I can write my little column every week, get a weekly check for it, but to make up for the fact that I had no business telling anyone else how to live, it was supposed to be a complete satire parody, where the joke is that what if Dear Abby was a Mexican man on Grindr? Like, that was the whole premise of the thing. And they were like, I love that. It's so funny. Yeah, do it. So I was mostly just going to, sounds really bad, I was mostly just going to make fun of whoever wrote into me, or I was going to answer it. But, like, instead of answering their question, I was just going to talk about how great I was, and, like, how I overcame something similar, but then end up in a place that was completely far removed from whatever their question was. I don't know if anyone has seen the show Space Ghost Coast to Coast before, but I was going to be modeled on that. It was going to be this, like, absurd, completely left field, like, it's supposed to be a talk show, but actually they're just ignoring their celebrity guests and fighting each other. Like, that sort of thing. And then when I actually got the letters and they were, like, super heartfelt, I was like, oh, shit. I have to take this seriously. And so the whole book is me reckoning with the fact of, like, oh my god, of course, I put myself in a position to be a gay mentor of sorts. I can't just bully these children. I have to, like, actually answer their questions. I have to practice some empathy here. So that is sort of where the whole advice column thing came from. It was never me being like, gosh, I sure can't wait to be Dear Abby one day, or I have all this wisdom to share with people, how do I get it out there? My writing role models were, like, humorists. There were people who were doing, like, really weird novels, doing fiction, doing, like, the kind of writing that I found really exciting. They weren't people writing advice columns, which, you know, there's some great writing in advice columns, but it's not really my thing, which is, you know, ironic now that that's my job.
Did the Carrie Bradshaw reference come from you, or did it come from people writing?
My marketing team said it would be great if
Okay.
it was something that everyone would recognize, and I was like, so when the book was written, and I knew I was completely free to sell out in every other direction, so I was like, whatever you need to call me to get this book sold, I am completely down with it. I was listing off, you know, vaguely problematic names for myself. They were just like, oh, can we do that? I believe it was originally like the Conte, Carrie Bradshaw, or something like that. And someone got mad, and they, like, took me aside. It was this other Mexican man. He's like, I can't believe they would, like, fetishize you that way, and, like, compare you to spicy food. I'm like, I know. He still doesn't know that was me.
Sometimes it's not that serious.
Well, you know, I went to my publisher, and I was like, the Mexican might hate this, actually. So it became the Chicano Carrie Bradshaw, which is, you know, much tamer and not as funny. But yeah, I was completely sort of open to whatever direction they needed to go to get this book in front of people. Because once the book was written, and I thought it was a good book, and they weren't going to fiddle with it anymore, I felt I was safe. So I was engaging in all sorts of, like, conversation with a publisher that I'm sure if I put on Twitter would cause a stir, like the maybe removing my shirt thing, where it was just like, I took that in complete stride. Or my editor was like, I hope you weren't offended by that. And I was like, I would take my shirt off if it meant selling more copies. It's just the case that, like, my readers aren't viscerally attracted to a cartoon version of me, so I don't see a reason. It was very that for a lot, and that's where Carrie Bradshaw comes from. I watched Sex and the City, but it's not like, wow, I need to be Carrie Bradshaw. Like, that. It's not something I ever thought. This is a lot of me explaining to the world that I have no real models and have no real goals. I'm just sort of, like, vibing. I'm just like, I just want to write stuff. I don't know. So my literary role models, they were sort of like the David Sedaris types. They were people who were doing funny stuff, people who wrote essay collections. I like the idea of a series of short tales coming together to tell some sort of collaborative whole message. And, you know, advice column actually wasn't super, it was pretty easy to launder my advice column into a book. I mean, like, an amazing writer who did that was Cheryl Strayed, who I really love. She wrote, like, a memoir and a collection of her advice columns, and the lane was sort of there for me. It was just that I happened to be this, like, gay Mexican who was doing it, which was the weird part. But even then, we had people like Ask a Mexican. That was a column that was pretty popular for a while. I think I was, well, if not then one of the very first, like, gay-specific advice columns, particularly to be run by a Mexican such as myself. But it is a field that is peopled by the kind of people who historically haven't been allowed to tell other kinds of stories. The history of the advice column is super fascinating, actually. I learned a lot about the advice column after I, like, swindled my way into it. Because I was like, I guess I should learn the history of this thing. A lot of women ended up writing advice columns because they weren't really allowed to write other things. It was one of the few ways they could make a name for themselves. And so back in the day, the original advice columns were people asking educated men who, or some of the few people that have college degrees, like, how does the wind work? And they would respond, and they would like answer a little question about little scientific things. So historically, actually, ever since it stopped being that and started being more issues of the heart, domestic issues, emotional issues, women could write under pen names and be a fake person and a persona and a character, and they were kind of allowed to make literary careers for themselves in that way. And it's funny that those doors are still open for marginalized people in the advice column community, I think. Like, I wanted to make a character, I wanted to make little jokey jokes, I wanted to tell some fun stories, and it just so happens to be that that medium was willing and able in that moment.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. I want to kind of, last few questions, talking about identity. So, it's Hispanic Heritage Month. We're kind of, as Latinos, we're like, okay, now you get to, or Pride Month or Black History Month, you're like, okay, now you have to get time to reflect on your identity, and you're kind of like, I'm not expected. You're like, okay, what are you gonna say? How Latino are you? And I think you opening talking with the excerpt was it's a bookend, good bookends, because Latin identity is so diverse. We're not all Cheech Martin, or we're not all Speedy Gonzalez. We're very different. So like you talked imposter syndrome. You talked about it's something that you experienced, but you also said too that you felt like a word missing in a sentence. So can you kind of explain that juxtaposition?
Yeah, identity is a really wild and treacherous thing today, and I think what a lot of people don't really think about when it comes to identity, I think a lot of people think of it as this fixed thing, that once you find out who you are, you uncover the truth, you can sort of live in that word and have it apply to you for the rest of your life, and you can be certain, you can be sure, I am this thing. And it almost feels unfair, or it felt unfair back in the day for me, because once I figured out I was gay, figured out I was Chicano, okay, good, we've got these two things, it's settled. And then the rest of my life came, and that narrative got troubled by new words, new ways of understanding things. These aren't fixed, complete static images. I think we're also like the word Latinx, for example, that's completely new, more or less, in the history of things. Do we want to use it? How do we want to use it? What does it mean? Who gets included by it? Who gets left out? The debates over language, the debates over identity are ongoing, and they will probably never stop as long as there are human beings around. And accepting the idea that these things are fluid was really hard, and it was really scary for me, because I feel like I fought so hard to figure out who I was, and now you're telling me that new information can threaten that. So like with Chicano identity, for example, the word Chicano is a very strange one. It denotes a person of Mexican heritage living in the United States. And then you start talking about like, okay, but like, what is the United States really? Because a lot of this place used to be Mexico, a lot of, Texas, California. And then what does it mean to be Mexican? What does it mean to be mestizo, which is a word that my family has often used for themselves. It's like a mix of indigenous and European blood. And then you get into like, okay, but how mestizo do you need to be? And then you get into troubling things like blood quantums and things like that. And there's all these things that you have to figure out and navigate. And if you're a simple person like me, it can be very scary and challenging, because every time I think I figured it out, something happens and I have to start from square one. And what I've realized is that I just can't afford to crumble like that every once in a while. I can't afford to have these ongoing crises every once in a while where it feels like I don't know who I am anymore, and it feels like I don't know how to identify. And so in the book, what I try to do is I try to make the case that those are linguistic sort of constructs, and they're oftentimes necessary and they can be important, but language will always fail to completely capture you, to capture an experience, to be able to actually hold all the complexities and nuances of any given group of people or any given individual. Because language is, at the end of the day, a pretty crude tool, and I say that as a person who loves language, who works in it. I happen to know it has many shortcomings. We're constantly trying to figure out the right words for people. We're trying to figure out, okay, who do we include? Who do we exclude? Because a lot of words are based on exclusion. And that's very tricky. And so in the book, I try to really hone in on my experiences, the people I've met, the things that I know to be true, that no matter what words I use to describe them, they will sort of remain. And in that way, I can sort of remain. I can have a core of myself while being more open-minded to the other things that go on. Debating whether or not the word queer, for example, is acceptable. Is it a slur? Is it something we reclaim? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I can't pretend that there will ever be a consensus on everything. That's just not how things work. And so when it comes to identity, and when it comes to, for example, I think maybe for the first time this year or last year, we're seeing politicians say, Happy Latinx Heritage Month, something that would be unthinkable even just a few years ago. That's a pretty big change. And it begets questions of who's Latinx, what is Latinidad, does it matter where you come from? Does it matter if you're in diaspora? I had a pretty weird Twitter fight with this white Brazilian lady the other day who lives in the UK, and I made a joke about Joyce Carol Oates that I shouldn't have made, where there was a picture of these plastic skeletons, and they were scaling a Victorian home or whatever, and someone was like, "Love this," and Joyce Carol Oates, this iconic author, for some reason quote tweets it, and it's just you can tell who's never experienced grief and who has never experienced loss by the way they make jokes of death like this. And I, for one, hope that Joyce Carol Oates never stops posting, because it's just, everything she does is just lady, where does this come from? But I screenshotted it, and I made this little joke, no one tell her about Mexicans, because, we love our skeletons. And death is, in a lot of Mexican culture, death is sort of a joke, Calaveras, Catrinas, everything. The sugar skulls, it's a little bit irreverent in a fun way, in a healthy way, I think. And so then, of course, that tweet goes viral, and I'm like, JP, why did you tweet? Again, a failure of will. And so this white Brazilian lady quote tweets it, and she's speaking Brazilian, but I can translate it because, it offers the option to translate, which I shouldn't have done. When people start quote tweeting in foreign languages, just dip. Mute that tweet. They can be calling you anything. Anyway, so she said something along the lines of, okay, but wow, Day of the Dead is actually a very serious holiday where we mourn our loved ones, and you're comparing it to plastic skeletons, gringo moment, or something like that. And I'm recently on Wellbutrin, a couple days ago I started, and I was in the airport on my Wellbutrin, ready to fight. Usually I let these things go, but the serotonin was just pumping in my body, and I was like, I have time today. Everything stopping me from tweeting is currently not in operation. I feel like I am made of light, and I can't be stopped, and I'm going to take you down. This is what my brain was saying. So I attacked her, and I think I said something really simple and stupid, where I like the idea of when someone presents you with this really offensive, nuanced critique, you just saying something back like, shut the fuck up, with multiple exclamation points, which is what I did. And anyway, so she starts fighting me back, which is what you do when some random person tells you to shut up on Twitter. You tell them, shut up back, and you kind of get into a dialogue. Anyway, this all has a point, which is to say that she is a white lady who was born in Brazil, living in the UK, calling me a gringo for making a Day of the Dead joke about Mexican culture. And, my army of bi teens, of course, jumps into the fray, and it's just, I can't believe you're telling this Mexican how to celebrate Day of the Dead. You're not even Mexican, you're not from there. And she Googles me, and she's like, he's from Oklahoma. Which complicates the narrative. So anyway, she's making the case that I have no idea what it's like to be a Latin American, because I don't live in Mexico, and that's not my holiday or something like that. And so she's calling me a gringo.
Before you read.
She's from her tea time or whatever she's doing in the UK. She's calling me a gringo. And so, mind you, this is all my fault. I should have never engaged with this random person on Twitter. Because on Twitter, you are going to find the wildest people to fight with. You can't be mad when they start saying any old thing. Because it's yes, this is what Twitter is here for. You make no sense. I don't make any sense. We're just babbling to each other. But it reminds me that there are so many weird articulations of identity that you have to reckon with. Because even if it's something ridiculous, right, where she's like, you're not a Mexican, you were born in the US, that's not Mexico, therefore you're a gringo, you have no right to claim that holiday, You're basically a white American, and me, I'm a Brazilian, I'm a Latina, blah, blah, blah. Even if it's something like really left field like that, you do have to sort of draw up a proof in your brain to be like, okay, so what makes me a Mexican then? What right do I have to celebrate this thing? And even if the answer is simple and one that you've gone over 100 times, it means that you had to think about it, and at some point you doubted it, and at some point you had to like kind of prove to yourself, yes, I deserve to celebrate this, I'm well within my right, blah, blah, blah. People will invalidate you in this life. People will tell you all sorts of things. They'll tell you what you're not way more than what you believe you are. They will tell you that you're something you're not. They will tell you you have no right to be who you are. They will tell you that your ancestry, you've got it figured out all wrong. And you have to be prepared for that sort of thing. And every Latinx Heritage Month that comes around, I'm like, great, it's time for me to engage in that yearly debate of what the hell a Mexican is, you know? And it's not usually fun because to me, it is so close to my chest. I think of my abuelos, I think of all the stories that I got from them. And for someone to so casually invalidate that every once in a while and just like, well, you're not a real Mexican, or you don't really know what's going on here. It's hard. And allowing for that sort of chaos and allowing for the idea that like, you know, we're not always going to agree. There's going to be a lot of weird, sometimes hurtful things being said, but at the end of the day, my ideology is flexible. My understanding of identity is flexible. I am not completely married to the idea that I'm definitely this thing. I'm always open to challenges. I'm always open to recontextualizing things because I'm a human being. What doesn't change are my experiences, the people I grew up around, the people I'm in community with. I think that kind of supersedes whatever I'm calling myself that day. And it has to, because otherwise I'm going to spend an entire afternoon and nearly miss my flight in the airport finding Elisa in London.
So, like, when you wrote your book, it's like you're talking about something very personal, and you're talking about, you know, it's like a journey of finding yourself. You know, the words that, you know, gay Chicano, and now you have people who are, you know, it's taken you a long time to get there. You're like, okay, this is who I am. And you have people coming for your identity, like, doesn't that suck sometimes?
Yeah.
It's horrible because you're like, people are reading this, people are looking at you like, oh, like this person is like being themselves. For, you know, I think about, I wonder what I'm saying, it has weight because I have this like platform, and you know, I may be like the only person of this like identity, and so like, if I say this one thing or say or do the wrong thing, like, it's like bad for all of us, you know, and so like, do you ever like think about that?
Yes, and other people think that about me as well, and I know this because this is some behind-the-scenes drama for you all. I'm in the process of like negotiating and selling the film TV rights for the book to certain companies, and that process has been very weird and very fraught. So some of them have been great meetings, other ones have given me some information about the way Hollywood works and the way some people think about certain identities that I would rather not know. So, for example, when I was taking these meetings originally, they had just happened during the In the Heights stuff. So, you know, after the discussions were brought up about the Afro-Latino erasure going on in the movie, et cetera, et cetera. And so, in two of the meetings I took about possibly turning my book into a TV show, I was asked straight up, like, and how do we incorporate, like, the In the Heights discourse into all of this? Like, will there be, like, Afro-Latinos present? And I'm like, in rural Oklahoma? They're like, yeah. And I was like, my family was the only people that lived on our hill. I can't just like fix all your diversity problems because you are not highlighting Afro-Latinos on a regular basis with all these mountains of resources you have. You can't just then turn around and be like, how can we make your thing the diversity show? How can we include all these different identities into your story? And it's like, I want all those stories to be told. I want people like that to be shown on screen, but you turning me into your one little circus where you put all of us doesn't do right by my story, doesn't do right by the art of storytelling, I think. It's just like, you're trying to use me to make yourself feel better, which is, I think, a position that a lot of marginalized people get put in, where it's like, yes, we have historically ignored your community, but now we're giving you attention, and how can we make you do work for us? How can we make you fix everything we've done wrong? And it's such an awkward position to be in, because you're forced to then engage in rhetoric that sounds like you don't want that, where it's just like, well, no, that's not part of my story. it sounds like, no, that means I don't want to see Afro-Latinos on TV or something. It's not about that. It's about you trying to fix the problems in your industry with me as your workhorse about it. And it's so complicated and it's so fraught. But at the end of the day, I really do believe that you have to stand by the story that you're telling. You have to be okay with just telling your story. Because at the end of the day, you have your little piece of the mosaic to contribute to the whole thing. You can't pretend, and it serves no one, to act or talk like you are representing people beyond your experience. So, for example, if I was just like, oh yeah, absolutely, I should just dabble into representing this community that I have never actually experienced firsthand. They didn't raise me and didn't grow up around them. But let me just pretend, because to you, everyone, I guess, south of the border is Mexican, right? That's not diversity. That's not representation. That is a corporate banding at the end of the day. And it's something that I'm very cognizant about avoiding. And I think it comes up a lot too in diversity months, where there is this soft bigotry happening every once in a while, where it's just this coddling, sort of oh, and it's so important that we represent voices like yours at our little corporate events, well, but you're given the least amount of resources, they're not paying you, everyone else is getting this honorarium, and everyone else is getting an actual raise, and you're not, you're supposed to be thankful for the opportunity to even be there. That again is not representation, it's not uplifting anyone, it is doing PR for someone else's company.
So, 140 characters less.
Yes.
My last question. What does Latinx, Latino pride mean to you? What's the tweet?
It just means survival at the end of the day. It means being here, being present, being able to do all the things that you want to do. I've come to realize that is overall the big deal in my life anyway, because there are all these roadblocks in your way. For example, publishing this book, I was so afraid that it would be a bad book and that it wouldn't sell well, and that would give my publisher one concrete reason to be and this is why we don't publish Latino books, this is why we don't publish gay books, because they don't sell well, and they don't do well. And I felt all this pressure to write this amazing book that did really well commercially and critically, because I didn't want to be the one who shut those doors for someone else. And that is just not a great way to live. It's not a great way to make art. It's not a great way to think about the thing you're making, because at the end of the day, it's not your job. So for me, that's what pride is. I think it's just I'm going to do my best. I'm going to be myself. I'm going to take the opportunities that I can and leave the door open behind me. And hopefully that is enough, because that is all I'm able to do.
Well, thank you for being you and being your authentic self, and thank you for coming back home and
Yes,
telling your
back
story. And you're amazing. I look forward to seeing what you do, and you're a rising star to me. So thank you for coming. So at this time, I'd conclude our interview with JP. Please take a button or buttons before you go. People will stick around for a little bit, but thank you all for coming.
And he has said he'll sign your book if you have your book tonight. He'll be
That's
happy
right,
to
I
sign
will.
that.
Build a nice little table over there. So.
And also, I just wanted to thank y'all for putting this on and having this amazing event tonight. It's been so much to me, so thank you. All the hard work.